My daughter-in-law stood up at the will reading and said she was cutting me out of my husband's $77 million estate. I sat there frozen. Not a tear left. I had cared for him when he couldn't walk. Now she acted like I never existed. But when the lawyer started to laugh, something shifted. What did Richard hide before he died? And why did it feel like he was speaking from beyond the grave? I stood alone in the garden after the funeral, watching the last guests drive away in silence. They left behind half-full cups, folding chairs, and the smell of gardenias. But no one thought to come back and ask if I needed a ride home, not even Victoria. She had arranged everything, of course, from the flowers to the slideshow, even down to the coffee cups. It was perfect in a way that made you feel like you were intruding. Cold, flawless, and timed to the second. Richard would have hated it. He used to say funerals should be messy. People should cry loud, tell bad jokes, forget their umbrellas. It should feel real. But this one didn't. It felt rehearsed, like I was sitting through the final act of a play I hadn't been invited to. When I stepped back inside the house, Victoria was already gathering up the folders from the dining table. I cleared my throat to speak, but she didn't look up, just kept stacking papers like a machine. Then she said without turning, "We'll be moving ahead with the legal processing next week. I've arranged everything with the firm. No mention of me. No question about what I wanted. No acknowledgement that I had spent the last 6 months sleeping on a chair next to Richard's hospital bed while she was too busy flying out for conferences. I wanted to believe it was stress or grief, or maybe she just didn't know how to talk to me, but then she handed me a small box with Richard's name on it. "He asked me to give you this," she said. Inside was a cufflink, just a silver cufflink. No note, no letter. Richard had drawers of journals and letters. We used to write notes to each other, even when we were in the same house, but in the end all I got was a cufflink, not even one he wore often. Victoria smiled politely and walked off like that was the end of it, like she had closed the book for both of us. That night I sat in the kitchen with a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea, and for the first time since Richard passed, I felt like I didn't belong in the home we built together. The walls still smelled like his cologne. His books were still in the hallway, but it was as if my name had been quietly erased from every room. I told myself maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was just tired. But something inside me had shifted. There was a coldness in the air I couldn't name. And it wasn't just from grief. It felt like I had been quietly written out of the story, like everyone had received a new script but me. Have you ever looked around your own home and felt like a stranger in it? That's what I felt that night, and it was only the beginning. The invitation came as an email, cold, formal, sent from Victoria's assistant, not even from her. Subject line: Estate Administration Meeting scheduled. I stared at it for a while, unsure whether to feel insulted or just numb. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday 9:00 a.m. at her firm's downtown Boston office. No message, no hope you're holding up, just a time and place like a dental appointment. That morning I arrived 5 minutes late. Traffic on the Mass Pike was bad, and I had stopped twice, unsure if I should even go. The elevator opened to a sleek reception area that smelled like eucalyptus and printer ink. A young assistant gave me a look that said she wasn't expecting someone like me. I smoothed down my coat and followed her into the conference room. The door closed behind me with a soft click. There were 7 people around the long table, all in dark suits. Victoria sat at the head, her hair pulled back, eyes fixed on a stack of folders in front of her. She didn't stand, didn't say hello. She just nodded slightly as if to say, "You can sit over there." I took the seat at the far end. It was the only empty chair away from the folders, away from the coffee. No one slid me a packet. No one offered a word. Victoria cleared her throat. "As executor of the estate," she began, "I'll be walking us through the distribution of assets as laid out in the finalized will." Her voice was sharp, professional, like she was hosting a board meeting. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap. I was the only one not holding a pen. She went over stocks, trust accounts, 2 commercial properties in Newton, and the partial ownership of a vineyard Richard had invested in with friends on Martha's Vineyard. Then she announced that Richard had transferred primary control of the family trust to her 6 months prior. I blinked. That wasn't possible. I had been managing that trust with Richard for nearly 20 years. He never mentioned anything about transferring it to her. Victoria continued without pause, reading off allocations like she was listing inventory. My name didn't come up. At the end, one of the associates asked, "And Mrs. Morgan's share?" Victoria barely looked up. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing. Just like that, no eye contact, no explanation, just the legal version of being erased. I felt a strange heat rise up my spine, but my hands stayed still. I didn't say a word. The room went quiet for a second too long, but no one addressed it. The meeting continued. When it was over, I waited for everyone else to leave. Victoria packed her briefcase slowly, almost as if she were expecting me to say something, but I didn't. I stood, adjusted my scarf, and walked out without looking back. Downstairs, the cold Boston air slapped my cheeks. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad yet, just hollow, like I'd watched a version of my life fold itself into a document and get filed away under someone else's name. Victoria didn't just claim the power in that room. She claimed the narrative, the house, the history. She had spoken over my silence, and no one had questioned it. Not once. As I walked toward the parking garage, one sentence echoed in my mind. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her. I wasn't a widow anymore. I wasn't even a line item. I was nothing. I went home and sat in the dark for a long time that afternoon. I didn't want to turn on the lights. The silence inside the house felt louder than any conversation I could bear. I still hadn't unpacked the last of Richard's things from Mass General. His cane rested by the back door where he had left it the last time we returned from chemo. I hadn't moved it. I couldn't. Later that evening, I opened the desk drawer in Richard's study. It wasn't anything deliberate. My hands just acted before my mind caught up. The drawer squeaked the way it always did. He used to say it needed oil. I always said I liked it the way it was. That sound meant he was home. Inside were old envelopes, receipts from book orders, his favorite fountain pen, and a few faded sticky notes with grocery reminders. At the very back, beneath a leather-bound ledger, I found a small manila folder I didn't recognize. No label, no date. I opened it and found 3 sheets of paper. The top one was a handwritten draft. His handwriting, unmistakable though a bit shaky, filled the page. No greeting, no signature, just a short note written in that quiet voice of his. Victoria wants me to update the will. Says it needs to reflect current holdings. I asked her why now, and she said it's for clarity. I think she's being careful, too careful. She started drawing up papers on my behalf. I haven't signed anything yet. I haven't told Eleanor. I know she'd ask the questions I'm afraid of. I stared at the paper. My eyes scanned it over and over, looking for some other meaning. But the message was plain. He had doubts. He hadn't told me. He had sensed something, but he stayed quiet. The second page was a photocopy of the most recent will I had never seen. Victoria had shown the signed version in the meeting, but this was clearly different. There were annotations in the margins, edits, corrections, several sections circled in red pen. My name had been there. The sentence read, "In the event of my passing, I leave my personal assets, including home shares and designated accounts, to my wife, Eleanor Morgan." It had been crossed out. Handwritten in the margin was a note discussed with Victoria. The third page was a typed schedule of appointments, legal consultations. 2 of the dates were from months ago, back when Richard was in and out of treatment. I hadn't known he was meeting with anyone. I was with him nearly every hour then. The only time he was ever alone was when Victoria came to take over. The folder was thin, but it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hands. I placed the pages gently on the desk and leaned back. The ceiling fan spun above me, slow and steady. I closed my eyes, thinking back to the last time Richard and I had talked about the will. It was over dinner. Simple calm like any other night. He had said, "You don't have to worry about anything, Elle. I've made sure of that." I remembered the way he reached across the table and squeezed my wrist. I remembered the way his thumb had pressed gently into my skin. Now all I could feel was the cold imprint of his absence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the study rereading the pages until the sky outside shifted from black to pale gray. I watched the morning take shape around me, one corner at a time. By dawn, I knew this wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't a clerical oversight. This was deliberate. Victoria had orchestrated something, and Richard had sensed it, maybe even tried to stop it, but it was too late. I placed the pages back in the folder and hid it under a stack of old National Geographic magazines in the hallway closet. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't let this go. The next morning, I called Daniel Chen. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Richard's retirement party. Daniel had always been steady, the kind of man who never raised his voice but still filled a room. Richard trusted him. So did I. He picked up on the second ring, and when I said my name, he paused for a beat before responding. His voice was calm, but I could hear the surprise underneath. He agreed to meet the next day. As I hung up the phone, I stood by the window and looked out over the yard. The wind was tugging at the last of the maple leaves, the same trees Richard had planted 30 years ago. He said they'd outlive us both, and maybe they would, but I wasn't going to let silence be the final thing he left behind. Not while I still had breath in me. Daniel met me at a quiet corner cafe in Brookline. It hadn't changed in years. Still the same wooden booths, chipped mugs, and soft jazz humming overhead. He slid into the seat across from me, coat still damp from the morning drizzle, and gave a quiet nod. I didn't waste time. I opened the manila folder and pushed it across the table. He read in silence, lips pressed into a thin line. When he reached the note in Richard's handwriting, his brow tightened. He didn't speak right away. He just flipped the pages back and forth like he was trying to stitch together a timeline in his head. I sat still, my hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea. Watching him read made the whole thing more real, like I hadn't imagined the edits or the red markings or that line that used to carry my name now crossed out in silence. He finally spoke. Not with panic, not with pity, just a quiet firmness that told me he had seen things like this before. It's more than suspicious, he said. It's intentional. He pulled out a notepad from his coat pocket and began making a list. He jotted down dates from the folder names of law firms Victoria had mentioned and circled one particular detail I hadn't thought about. The witness signatures on the updated will weren't names I recognized. Neither of them had ever stepped foot in our home. Richard had always preferred to use people he knew, a neighbor, a friend from the country club. The fact that Victoria had brought in outside witnesses without telling me raised more than a few red flags. We agreed to dig quietly. No confrontation. Not yet. Daniel said we'd start with validating the last version of the will filed with Suffolk County. He would request certified copies and cross-check them with the notes I had. In the meantime, I would keep everything else exactly as it was. Back at home, I opened the hallway closet and tucked the folder into a lockbox we used for passports and medical papers. Then I sat at Richard's old desk and opened his calendar. Victoria had taken most of his belongings already. She had boxed up his books, donated his clothes, and sent his golf clubs off to a friend. But the calendar was still here, a simple leather-bound planner with notes scribbled in pencil. That was where I found the name Harold Garrison. It was penciled in on a Tuesday morning, circled twice. I recognized the name faintly. He was a tax consultant Richard had met through a nonprofit years ago. I hadn't seen him in ages, but the fact that Richard had met him while he was ill and never told me stung more than I wanted to admit. I called Daniel and told him. He said he'd look into it, maybe get in touch discreetly. If Harold had been part of the estate planning process, even briefly, he might have seen something Victoria didn't intend for anyone to notice. The next few days passed slowly. I went about my routines as if nothing had changed. Grocery shopping at Whole Foods, watering the plants, attending my book club in Cambridge, though I barely spoke a word that week. On the surface, everything looked the same, but underneath, I was alert, watching, waiting. Then on Friday, Daniel called. He had spoken with Harold. What he told me made my stomach drop. Harold remembered Richard coming in looking thin and exhausted, barely able to hold a pen. They talked for nearly an hour about the trust. Richard had questions about naming beneficiaries and ensuring long-term protections for me, but Harold said Richard seemed hesitant. He kept saying Victoria would take care of things, that she was helping. Harold had offered to set up an independent review just to make sure everything was filed clearly and transparently, but Richard never followed through. A week later, Victoria called to cancel the appointment and said Richard no longer needed the service. Daniel paused on the phone, letting that part sink in. He said Harold still had the intake notes. They weren't legally binding, but they proved Richard had concerns. They showed intent doubt, and that might be enough to open a formal inquiry if we decided to go that route. I thanked him and sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still in my hand, long after the call ended. That night, I pulled out an old photo album, not for nostalgia, but for clarity. I looked at pictures of Richard at family events, holidays, dinners with friends. In nearly every photo, Victoria was somewhere in the background, smiling, helping, hovering. I had once believed she was loyal, that she wanted what was best for us. But now I couldn't unsee it, the careful positioning, the way she always managed to be the one people trusted with the logistics, the documents, the plans. She had been preparing for this for a long time, and the part that hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was realizing that Richard had known something was wrong and didn't tell me. I placed the album back on the shelf and turned off the light. There was no anger in me. Not yet. Only a quiet resolve that whatever Victoria had rewritten, I would find a way to write back. I didn't sleep much after the call with Daniel. I'd always believed in patience and giving people time to show you who they really are. But now each day that passed without answers felt like I was letting Victoria rewrite history in her favor. The following Monday, Daniel called again. His tone was different, faster, more urgent, but still steady. He had reviewed county records and found something odd. The final copy of Richard's will that was filed and executed bore a different case number than the original draft. That alone wasn't alarming, but the original version, the one Richard and I had reviewed together a year prior, had vanished from the official archive. It had been marked as superseded, but no documentation showed who had initiated the change. Daniel said he wanted to bring in someone else. Her name was Lydia Vasquez, a probate litigation specialist. She had experience in contested wills and document fraud. I agreed, though part of me hesitated. The deeper we dug, the more I worried we'd find something even worse. We met at Daniel's office on Wednesday morning. Lydia was sharp in both tone and presence, mid-50s, dressed simply, no wasted movement. She listened while Daniel laid out what we had so far. She asked questions, none directed at me. Then she requested copies of everything: notes, calendar entries, the scans Harold had provided, even Victoria's official notices. When Daniel mentioned the unknown witnesses, she raised an eyebrow. She said their names had come up before in another case. Unlicensed notaries paid to sign documents without proper presence or review. She jotted down details on a legal pad without pause, then looked up and said, "This wasn't just sloppy. It looks constructed." I didn't speak for a while, just watched the two of them work like surgeons over the remnants of my life. Then I stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. Richard used to say he liked offices with a view because they reminded him how small we really were, that no matter how much we planned, life still moved on above and below us. Before I left, Lydia said she would file an inquiry with the probate court. If Victoria had filed anything improper, there'd be a trace, an email, a timestamp, even a paper trail disguised as routine. Back home, I went into the garage for the first time in weeks. I opened Richard's old file cabinet. It still had a faint scent of tobacco and cedar. I pulled out one of the bottom drawers, the one he used for tax records. Inside were folders marked by year, going back nearly 2 decades. In the folder for the previous year, I found a document titled Revocable Living Trust Addendum. It was unsigned. The draft language had been changed several times, as if Richard had gone back and forth on how to word it. But what struck me was the section titled Survivor Protections. My name was there, written clearly with annotations in his handwriting, suggesting additional provisions: healthcare, housing, legal support, things he wanted to ensure I would never worry about. Beside that, in the margin, Richard had scribbled a line I recognized immediately. "We talked about this. Victoria said she'd handle it." It felt like I was seeing the moment he handed over the reins, the moment he stepped back, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe out of misplaced trust. I made a copy of the document and called Daniel. He said to bring it in the next morning. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and listened to the wind. My body ached in a way I hadn't noticed before, not from age, but from the weight of carrying secrets that didn't belong to me. I thought about how easily my name had been removed from something Richard and I had built over a lifetime, and how quickly someone else had stepped in to fill the silence he left behind. For years I thought love meant trusting without question. But maybe love also meant protecting the truth when someone else couldn't, even if that truth was inconvenient, even if it meant tearing open wounds that had barely begun to heal. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and dressed carefully, not for vanity, but for clarity. I needed to feel like myself again, like the woman Richard married, not the ghost Victoria kept trying to edit out of the story. I arrived at Daniel's office with the new document. Lydia was already there. She read it quietly, lips pressed tight. When she finished, she looked up and said it would help a lot. She explained their next step, a motion to preserve remaining estate assets. If the court granted it, Victoria would lose the ability to move funds or property until the investigation was resolved. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. I nodded. I didn't need revenge. I needed space to breathe and the chance to remember Richard, not as a man who left me behind, but as someone who had tried and maybe failed to shield me in the end. But if she had rewritten the terms of our life, then I would rewrite the ending on my own terms, quietly, intentionally, and it would begin now. Lydia called me 3 days later with news. The motion to freeze the estate had been approved. It was a temporary order, but it meant Victoria could no longer move funds or reassign property titles without the court's knowledge. I didn't say much when she told me. I just exhaled and let the silence settle in. It felt like the first solid step forward. That same afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed invitation. Victoria was hosting a private event at the Wellesley Country Club, a tribute to Richard Cocktails, and catered hors d'oeuvres a charity auction in his name. On the back, I noticed the date just 4 days away. I stared at it for a long time. There had been no mention of this, no phone call, no text. And yet she had the gall to send me a glossy invite with embossed lettering, as if I were a guest and not the woman who spent 43 years by Richard's side. I didn't throw it away. I tucked it inside the drawer next to the couch and sat with the thought. That evening, I called Daniel. I told him I wanted to attend. He didn't ask why. He simply offered to accompany me in case anything unexpected happened, but I declined. This wasn't about confrontation. Not yet. This was about presence, about standing still in a room that someone else had tried to erase me from. When Saturday arrived, I dressed carefully. Navy slacks, a silk blouse Richard had bought me for our 35th anniversary, a thin silver chain, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but everything intentional. The country club parking lot was already full when I arrived. I recognized half the names on the guest list at the door. Friends of Richard's colleagues, board members, people who had shared dinners at our house, toasted anniversaries, written Christmas cards. Inside the room was bright, polished wood floors, floral centerpieces. A photo of Richard framed in gold stood near the bar. It was the one Victoria had insisted on using for the obituary, the one where he looked tired, his smile weak. I hated that photo. Victoria was in the center of it all, elegant, composed, every movement calculated. She greeted guests with a half tilt of her head like a queen receiving loyal subjects. When she saw me, her expression flickered for just a second. Then she smiled. I nodded but didn't return it. I made my way toward a quieter part of the room near a table of display items for the auction. They were labeled as Richard's favorite things: a signed Red Sox baseball, a vintage pen, a first edition novel I had given him on his birthday. I reached for it, touched the corner of the spine. My name was nowhere on the label. I stepped back. A man I didn't recognize approached and introduced himself as one of Richard's former business partners. He spoke kindly, said it was good to see me. Then he asked how I was managing the estate, whether I'd made any changes to the fund allocations. I stared at him, caught off guard. He assumed I was still the trustee. When I told him I wasn't, that I had been removed before Richard passed, his face shifted slight confusion, polite discomfort. Then he nodded and stepped away. It wasn't much, but it told me something. Victoria hadn't told everyone the full truth, not about the will, not about the shift in control, not even about the auction items she had taken from my home without my consent. I stayed only another 20 minutes, just long enough to speak with one of Richard's old board colleagues who mentioned almost in passing that he had received an email from Victoria weeks before Richard passed. It had included suggested donation amounts, legal language, and the phrase managing partner responsibilities. I thanked him, smiled, and excused myself. Back in the car, I sat with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel. That was the moment it all crystallized. Victoria hadn't waited for Richard to pass. She had started orchestrating the transition while he was still breathing. She had used his illness as cover, his trust as currency, and my silence as permission. But that silence was ending. The next morning, I met with Daniel and Lydia. I handed them my notes. Everything I'd gathered from that night, every phrase, every inconsistency. Lydia leaned back, thoughtful. This was more than a financial violation. Now this pointed to intentional premeditation and potentially coercion. Daniel agreed. They would begin drafting a motion to contest the will, not just for my share, but for the integrity of Richard's last wishes. I left their office and walked home slowly, not because I was tired, but because I needed every step to remind me who I still was. The wife, the witness, the one left standing after the applause, had faded, and now the one finally ready to speak. The following Monday began with rain-thin, steady, unyielding. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching the drops hit the window like tiny reminders that the world keeps moving even when everything inside you has paused. At exactly 9:15, Daniel called. He said Lydia had filed the motion to challenge the will on formal grounds of potential fraud and undue influence. The court had accepted the filing and scheduled a preliminary hearing within 2 weeks. It would be short, just enough time to lay out the foundation, but it would allow for discovery. That meant we could begin requesting internal communications, financial records, and digital documents from Victoria's firm. It felt like opening a sealed door. That afternoon, I met Lydia at her office. She was already on a call, so her assistant ushered me into the small conference room, where copies of estate documents had been spread across the table, color-coded tabs, printed emails, a partial timeline taped to the wall. Lydia joined me 10 minutes later, holding a printout. It was an email Victoria had sent 6 weeks before Richard passed, marked confidential. The subject line read, "Revised structure, immediate actions." The body of the message was short but clear. Victoria had instructed her team to expedite the finalization of trust documents and remove all clauses she considered discretionary. My name had been referenced once, a short sentence, "Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion." That was all. My entire presence, my decades beside Richard, reduced to a line item in someone else's email chain. Lydia didn't look at me. She didn't need to. She simply asked if I was ready to proceed with the hearing and the formal process that would follow. I said yes with no hesitation. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet determination. I avoided unnecessary conversations. I kept my head down. I walked each evening through the neighborhood, passing houses that still had wreaths from the winter holidays. Nothing looked different on the outside, but I knew better now. The most dangerous betrayals never announced themselves with sirens. They arrived softly in emails and ink in the erasure of a name. By Thursday, Lydia had compiled enough documentation to begin issuing subpoenas. She filed to obtain full access to Richard's digital communications during the final 6 months of his life. She also submitted a request to depose one of Victoria's legal assistants, someone who had notarized the disputed documents under Victoria's supervision. Daniel reviewed the files and noted inconsistencies in 2 signature timestamps. Both had been logged on a Sunday evening when the office was supposed to be closed. When I read that detail, my hands went still. Richard hated working weekends, and he never signed anything without asking me to read it first. Something about those Sunday dates told me everything I needed to know. I gave Lydia permission to request a forensic handwriting expert. We would compare Richard's known signatures from his medical files with the ones on the revised documents. It wouldn't be definitive, but it would be enough to raise serious doubts. I sat in silence that night, not in grief, but in clarity. For the first time in months, I felt the balance beginning to shift. That weekend I drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery. It was quiet. The sky was low and gray. Richard's headstone was simple, his full name, the dates a short line beneath. He lived with grace. He left with love. I stood there for a long while. I didn't speak to him, not out loud, but I let the weight of the moment settle in. I knew now that he had trusted the wrong person, and he had left too much undone, but I no longer held that against him. I had spent too many nights wondering what he was thinking near the end, wondering if he had tried to protect me and failed. But it didn't matter anymore, because now I would protect the truth myself. When I returned home, there was a message from Lydia, short, direct. The assistant had agreed to speak. She would be deposed the following Tuesday, and she was prepared to talk about inconsistencies she had noticed. She wasn't sure what it all meant, but she had kept notes. That was the moment everything cracked open. Victoria had orchestrated the edits. She had silenced dissent, but she had forgotten the smallest variable. Someone had watched. Someone had noticed. And now someone was ready to speak. As I turned off the lights that night, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment longer than usual. The bed was still neatly made. The photo on the dresser, the one of us in Maine laughing in the wind, was still tilted just a bit to the left. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a stranger in my own story. I felt like a woman returning to her rightful place, not in anger, but in truth. Tuesday morning was crisp and quiet when I arrived at Lydia's office. The city hadn't fully woken yet, and the sidewalk still held that early fog that made everything feel muted, suspended in time. Inside the conference room, lights were already on. Daniel was there, sorting through a thick folder of printed records. Lydia stood near the window, speaking softly on the phone. On the table sat a small voice recorder and a cup of tea someone had made for the guest we were waiting for. Her name was Ava Morrison, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, but with a kind of restlessness in her hands, like she hadn't yet figured out where to put her fear. She walked in exactly on time, wearing a gray cardigan and dark jeans. No makeup, no jewelry, just a quiet kind of resolve. Lydia offered her a seat, then laid out the parameters of the deposition. Ava nodded. She understood. She had already reviewed the documents. She had kept her own copies. She wasn't there to accuse anyone directly. She only wanted the truth to be clear. She began with the timeline. Victoria had brought her into the estate revisions 6 weeks before Richard passed. Ava said she found it unusual that certain standard procedures were bypassed. Normally, when someone of Richard's stature amended a will or trust, there were meetings, review sessions, notarized acknowledgments. But in this case, things had moved too fast. Ava described one evening when she stayed late at the office. She had gone back to retrieve her jacket and saw Victoria and another staffer inside the conference room with a stack of unsigned forms. Victoria had asked her to witness a signature. She hadn't seen Richard sign it directly. When she asked, Victoria had brushed it off, said he'd just stepped out, said it was urgent, just witness it. No big deal. That moment had lingered in Ava's mind enough that she jotted it down in her planner. She brought that page with her. The note was simple, 7:43 p.m. Sunday. Witnessed signature for V, no R present. Lydia asked a few gentle clarifying questions. Ava answered them with composure. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't looking for trouble. But she had noticed inconsistencies. The date of the signature didn't match the file metadata. The formatting of the will had been changed to remove reference sections that would have required my countersignature as co-trustee. Daniel and Lydia exchanged a glance. Then Ava said something else. She remembered overhearing Victoria on a call in her office speaking to someone about distributing assets quickly. The phrase that stuck with her was liquidate silently, no delays. That was 2 days before Richard was hospitalized for the final time. When Ava left that evening, she said she knew something was off. But Victoria had power influence, and Ava had a mortgage, a child, a job she couldn't afford to lose. Now, hearing how much had come into question, she said she couldn't stay silent. She signed her statement, dated it. Lydia thanked her, and Daniel walked her out. When the door closed, Lydia sat down and placed both hands flat on the table. That was the break we needed. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. We had a timestamp, a first-hand witness language that suggested manipulation, maybe even preemptive intent enough to bring it before a judge and request a formal examination of the entire trust administration. Daniel leaned back, breathing deep. It was the first time I saw relief on his face, but I didn't feel it. Not yet, because I knew what would come next. Victoria would find out. And when she did, she wouldn't panic. She would plan. 2 days later, it began. I received a letter from her attorney, polished cold. They accused me of interfering with a lawful estate transition. They claimed I was motivated by grief, misunderstanding, and personal bitterness. They threatened to pursue legal costs if I didn't withdraw my motion within 10 business days. I read the letter 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it beside my morning coffee. Then I called Daniel. He asked if I was okay. I told him I'd been more than okay for years. I'd just been quiet. But silence wasn't the same as surrender. He laughed softly, said that was the best thing he'd heard all week. That afternoon, Lydia submitted our full rebuttal. Attached were Ava's notes, her formal deposition, metadata comparisons, Richard's prior drafts, and calendar logs from the office security system showing he hadn't entered the building the weekend. The new documents were supposedly signed. The package was heavy. It carried weight, but more than that, it carried intent. We weren't accusing for the sake of revenge. We were reclaiming a truth that had been buried under convenience and control. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a blanket and listened to the wind through the trees. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel something new. Not sadness, not rage, but steadiness, a grounded kind of knowing. Victoria had rewritten Richard's final chapter, but now the red ink had bled through and I was still holding the original manuscript. The invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope. No stamp, just slipped through my front door. It wasn't from Victoria directly, of course. It came from the estate board, co-signed by one of Richard's oldest partners. An official meeting was being held at the foundation's new office space to finalize the transfer of executive authority. There was no mention of the lawsuit, no mention of my contestation, only the tone of finality. It was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. I read it over coffee once, then twice. Then I folded it and set it beside my breakfast plate like it was nothing more than a flyer. But inside, I knew this wasn't just a courtesy. It was a performance. Victoria wanted me to see what she believed she had already won. She wanted me to watch her settle into the chair I used to sit beside, to smile like she had earned it. I called Lydia, told her I'd be attending. Daniel hesitated when I mentioned it, but I told him not to worry. I wouldn't make a scene. I just needed to see it, needed to feel the distance between who I used to be and who I was becoming. That Thursday, I arrived 5 minutes early. The new foundation office was a glass box downtown, all marble floors and quiet elevators. A receptionist led me to the conference room. I recognized a few faces, men Richard had worked with on the education initiative, women who had once hugged me at banquets and handed me plates of catered chicken while calling me sweetheart. They all smiled, polite, controlled, but none asked me where I'd been. At the head of the table sat Victoria. Her suit was dark blue, her hair pulled back in a perfect knot. She wore a simple watch and a white blouse, power dressed in quiet tones. When she saw me, her smile barely shifted, a flick of surprise, then poise again. I nodded and took the empty seat at the far end. The meeting began with pleasantries, a review of recent donations, notes about upcoming initiatives. I listened in silence. It was all standard, strategic language with no soul. When they reached the item marked Transition of Executive Oversight, Victoria cleared her throat. She began thanking everyone for their support. Talked about Richard's vision, about continuity, about the weight of responsibility. It was well rehearsed. Then she said something that made the room pause. She thanked me, said I had stood by Richard in his early years, said I had helped lay the foundation for what the organization had become. But then she said the phrase I'll never forget. And now, with your grace, I carry it forward. Your grace. Like I had bowed, like I had handed it over. I sat still, completely still. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope. Quietly, I passed it to the man beside me, Richard's oldest friend still on the board. He looked confused, but took it. Inside was a copy of the notarized letter Ava had signed, along with a brief summary from Lydia's legal brief and a red-marked copy of the page Victoria had altered in the original trust agreement. He didn't say a word. He simply passed it to the next person and the next. Within moments, Victoria noticed. Her smile tightened. Her hands stopped moving. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I just let the paper travel. When it reached the end of the table, I stood. "Thank you for the invitation," I said. "My attorney will be in touch if anyone here requires clarification." And I walked out. Not rushed, not angry, just clear. I drove home with the windows cracked, letting the city noise seep in. Lydia called me that evening. She had already heard from one of the board members. They were concerned. They wanted a separate internal review before proceeding with any final transfer of authority. Daniel said it best. That moment at the table wasn't a confrontation. It was a redirection. Victoria had expected me to fade. She never expected me to show up with the truth. Over the next few days, things shifted again, quietly but meaningfully. The board postponed their vote. Victoria's lawyer went silent. A request was made for a neutral third party to evaluate the contested amendments. Even if nothing came of it legally, the stain was there now. The doubt, the hesitation. And in that space, I found something I hadn't felt in months: equilibrium. That Saturday, I took Richard's old file box from the study, the one with the foundation's original charter, his notes on mentorship programs, the first grant proposal he ever wrote. I read through each page slowly. Then I packed them up and called Daniel. I wanted them archived properly, not buried in legal boxes, not attached to anyone's name, just preserved. The story of what we built together before it was tampered with. I ended that week with a walk along the Charles River near our old house. The air was cold but clean, the kind of cold that wakes you, sharpens your hearing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to defend myself. The truth had its own voice now. It didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It just existed, undeniable, unmoved. And that was enough. The days after the board meeting were strangely still. No calls, no threats, no letters with lawyered language or veiled demands. It was as if a curtain had fallen on the stage Victoria had carefully crafted, and now the audience had quietly left their seats. But I didn't mistake silence for resolution. Lydia warned me that these moments were often the most strategic. When things go quiet, it means people are regrouping. But this time I wasn't the one who needed to prepare. I had already done my part. I had already told the truth. Now it was her turn to reckon with it. I spent that week back in my own rhythm, small things, watering the plants, reading the Globe at the kitchen table, making soup the way Richard used to like it. I no longer felt the rush to chase explanations. Some parts of betrayal will always remain unexplained, and I had made peace with that. Then came Sunday. Lydia called just after noon. She had received an unexpected email from Victoria's legal team. There would be no further challenge to the trust inquiry. In fact, Victoria was withdrawing from her position as managing executive of the foundation entirely. She offered no admission of wrongdoing, only a statement about preserving the foundation's reputation and respecting Richard's legacy. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I simply walked outside with a coat and let the winter air hit my face cold, honest, and clarifying. The following Tuesday, the foundation released a short press statement confirming the transition. They named a temporary oversight committee made up of older board members who had worked directly with Richard during the early years. Daniel forwarded me a copy along with a personal note from one of them. It said only this: "You were right to protect what mattered." I stared at those words longer than I expected to. They weren't flashy. They didn't repair the pain, but they acknowledged something deeper than apology. That week, Lydia and I met one last time in person. She had prepared a summary of where the case stood and what next steps we could pursue if I wanted to formally seek damages or restitution. She laid out every path clearly, every option measured and neat. I thanked her, but I told her no. I wasn't interested in dragging things further. Not because I had forgiven Victoria, but because I had already won the part that mattered most to me. I had taken back my name from a document that tried to erase it. I had reinserted myself into a history I helped build, and more than anything, I had refused to become small in the eyes of my own story. That night, I sat in my study and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were handwritten notes from Richard, some letters, old travel receipts, his list of books he never got around to reading. There was also a sealed envelope I didn't recognize, not labeled, just left there tucked behind an old ledger. I opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of an earlier will dated a year before the revision Victoria had filed. In it, Richard had detailed specific wishes about the foundation, the trust, and my role as lifelong co-trustee. There were pages of notes written in the margins, personal phrases, mentions of trips we had taken, and conversations we'd had about legacy and balance. My eyes welled as I read the final paragraph. He had written that no matter what happened, he wanted the values we built together to remain at the core of everything the foundation touched. That family wasn't about last names or blood ties. It was about standing beside each other in silence when no one was watching. He had signed it in pen. No witness, just intention. I sat with that paper until the room grew dark. The next morning, I took the document to Daniel and asked him to archive it. Not for evidence, not for any court, just for history. A few weeks later, I returned to the foundation for the first time since the fallout. The atmosphere was quieter, less polished, less intimidating. The new committee greeted me warmly. They asked for guidance on one of Richard's early scholarship programs. I offered to review the files and help where I could. They didn't ask me to return in any official role, and I didn't expect them to. That wasn't the point anymore. I wasn't there to be appointed. I was there to witness, to make sure what we had built together didn't vanish under someone else's edits. I left after an hour, walking slowly to the parking lot. The winter sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. I stood by my car and looked back at the glass building. It shimmered, but it no longer intimidated me. It was just a place, a vessel, and I no longer needed its approval. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat by the window with a cup of tea. I thought of Richard, of Ava, with her quiet bravery, of Lydia and Daniel, who had shown up not just as professionals, but as people who believed in integrity. And I thought of myself, not the woman who sat silent during that first reading of the will, but the woman who had returned fully, not to fight, but to be seen, to reclaim her place, to write the end of the story with her own hand. It had been a month since Victoria's formal withdrawal, and in that time the world around me softened in ways I didn't expect. Without court dates, without lawyers on hold, without the weight of documents and signatures waiting to be reviewed, I began to move differently. Mornings started slower. I no longer reached for my planner before I'd finished my tea. I'd sit in the sunroom with Richard's old blanket across my legs, the winter light spilling across the hardwood floors, and let the stillness be enough. That stillness, I realized, was not the absence of chaos. It was the reward of having faced it. Lydia came by one afternoon to drop off a final packet. It was mostly formalities now. She had taken care of closing out the inquiries, recording statements, ensuring my role in the original trust was acknowledged and filed under public record. It was done. There was no more to challenge. We didn't talk much that day. She gave me a soft smile, handed over the envelope, and we sat for a few minutes without saying anything. Then she stood and squeezed my hand gently before leaving. After she left, I placed the folder in the top drawer of Richard's desk, not locked away, just placed like it belonged there alongside his notes and his quiet convictions. That weekend, I visited the garden behind the community center we had helped fund years ago. It was winter, yes, but the groundskeeper had already planted early bulbs, daffodils, iris, some crocus waiting beneath the surface. Even beneath the frost, life prepares to bloom. I walked the edge of the pathway, remembering the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the way Richard had held my hand as they unveiled the plaque. It still stood there, a little weathered now, but steady, just like us. It read, "In honor of those who plant for a future they may never see." There had been times in the last few months when I feared that future had been erased, but it hadn't. It had only been buried under pride and ambition, and now it was uncovered again. Later that week, I received a letter from one of the young scholars who had been part of our first education initiative. She had heard about the changes in the foundation. She wanted me to know how much the grant she'd received years ago had changed her life. She was now working at a local nonprofit mentoring young girls from neighborhoods like the one she had grown up in. Her note was brief but powerful. She didn't know the full story. She didn't need to. What mattered was that something we started had reached her, and now she was passing it forward. That night, I sat in my kitchen and looked around. It was the same space where I had once felt shut out, unseen, voiceless. But now the silence was different. Now it was full. It held memory, clarity, and peace. I had not burned anything down. I had simply refused to disappear. Spring came slowly that year. The daffodils in the community garden bloomed first, followed by the soft blush of early tulips that lined the sidewalk outside the foundation office. I didn't go often, just enough to feel connected, just enough to remember. One morning, I received a small invitation in the mail, cream envelope, raised lettering. It was for the annual donors' luncheon, something Richard and I had helped establish 2 decades ago, but hadn't attended in years. It felt strange seeing my name listed on the honored guests again. I wasn't sure I'd go, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. But I went. I chose a soft gray suit and pinned Richard's old lapel pin to my collar, the one he used to wear when speaking publicly. A small oak tree in silver, steady-rooted quiet. The ballroom hadn't changed. Polished floors, round tables, soft music in the background, people mingling, exchanging polite updates. Victoria wasn't there. Her name had faded from the printed programs, replaced by the interim committee and a new vision statement. I didn't speak much. I just watched. And near the end of the event, something unexpected happened. One of the newer board members, a woman named Lisa, took the stage. She was young but spoke with calm and grace. She thanked those who had guided the foundation through the transition, and then she paused. She looked in my direction and said my name, not with ceremony, but with warmth. She spoke briefly about the early days, about Richard's original mission, and about the quiet strength of those who had held that mission through storms. Then she stepped down, and the room turned toward me in a wave of gentle applause. I stood just briefly, and I nodded, not for recognition, not for attention, but as a final gesture, a small acknowledgement that the long road I had walked was no longer hidden. It had a name now, and that was enough. That night, I walked home alone. I passed the old bookstore where Richard used to stop every Sunday. I smiled when I saw that they had placed a copy of his favorite novel in the window display. Back in my kitchen, I brewed tea and opened the back door. The air was cool, soft. I stepped outside and looked at the sky. It was wide open and completely mine. I was not a woman erased. I was not a placeholder in someone else's version of legacy. I was whole, and I was finally home in my own story,